Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Forbidden Path. I've always been a lover of hiking. The solitude, fresh air, and silence of the forests always drew me in, especially in remote regions. But my last adventure in a mountainous forest taught me that not every place deserves to be explored. Some paths lead to places that should never be discovered. I was traveling alone through the countryside, searching for lesser-known trails. I arrived at a small village nestled at the foot of a mountain range. It was a peaceful place where everyone seemed to know each other, and the locals looked at me with shy curiosity. While chatting with the owner of a local inn, I mentioned my passion for hiking. He hesitated before replying, but eventually told me about a forest to the north, known for its stunning landscapes. However, when I asked about the old path, his expression changed. He became serious, almost uneasy, and warned me, "That path leads to a strange place. It's not safe. Many who've entered have never returned." I thought his comment was an exaggeration and laughed, but he didn't smile. An elderly woman who had been listening nearby also warned me, "There are things in that forest that don't belong to this world." The old path is an invitation to the unknown. My curiosity was piqued. Warnings like that didn't scare me, they only made me want to explore more. Early the next morning, I followed the directions to the entrance of the Forbidden Trail. The trail was subtle, almost invisible. The entrance was marked by a tall, dead tree with peeling bark that resembled a twisted, pained face. As soon as I stepped in, I noticed the air was different. It was colder, heavier, and the usual forest sounds were muted. No bird song, no buzzing insects, just the distant sound of wind weaving through the trees. The first hour of hiking was uneventful. The trail wound through a dense forest with towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight. But gradually, I began to notice something strange. The trees around me seemed to lean toward the path, forming a natural tunnel that grew darker as I moved forward. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. At one point, the air grew so cold that I could see my breath. Then I found the first markings. Symbols were carved into the trees, resembling runes, but in a form I had never seen before. Some looked like spirals, others were intersecting lines in chaotic patterns. When I touched one, the bark felt unnaturally warm. A shiver ran down my spine, but I kept going. After a bend in the trail, I heard the first sound, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking in a language I didn't understand. I stopped and looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper continued, coming from all directions as if the entire forest were speaking. I decided to quicken my pace. A few minutes later, I reached a clearing. In the center stood what appeared to be a stone altar, covered in moss and surrounded by smaller stones engraved with more symbols. The air there was different, heavier, as if something invisible was pressing down on my shoulders. I approached the altar and realized it wasn't a natural formation. It was carefully sculpted, with spiraling designs that seemed almost alive, faintly glowing under the dim light. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder. It was as if dozens of voices were all around me. When I turned to leave, I saw something that made me freeze: shadows. They were among the trees, long and distorted, yet distinctly human in shape. They didn't move like normal people. Their limbs seemed to float, and their eyes glowed faintly with a pale light. The first shadow took a step toward me, and the whispers turned into a low, muffled scream, like a distant chorus. My entire body went cold, and a sense of dread overwhelmed me. Without thinking, I began to run back down the trail. The trees now seemed closer together, almost closing off the path as if trying to trap me. The ground was covered in roots that seemed to reach for my feet. As I ran, I could hear the shadows behind me. Their steps were light but fast, like they were gliding over the leaves without making a sound. One of them got so close that I felt an intense chill on my back, as if it had almost touched me. When I finally saw the dead tree marking the trail's entrance, relief flooded me. I sprinted out of the forest and didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I turned to look back, the forest appeared normal, but something glowed faintly among the trees, pale eyes watching me. I returned to the village that same day and told the innkeeper what had happened. He simply shook his head. "You were lucky. They usually take those who wander too far." I never went back to that forest. And even years later, sometimes at night, I still hear the whispers, as if something from that trail is still following me. Story 2. The Cabin in the Clearing. My passion for camping has taken me to many isolated places, but none left a mark as deep as a small forest I visited years ago. I had heard about its untouched trails and the absolute silence that surrounded it. What no one mentioned, however, was the hidden cabin in the heart of the woods. I arrived early that morning with a backpack full of supplies in the hope of finding a quiet spot to spend the night. The initial trail was well marked, but after a few hours, it disappeared into the dense trees. I decided to follow a stream that meandered through the forest, trusting it would lead me to a good place to set up camp. After some time, the forest began to change. The sound of the running water faded until it was almost non-existent, and the air felt colder. The trees around me were older, their exposed roots twisted like claws. That's when I saw it, a cabin partially hidden among the trees. Its wooden planks were covered in moss, and the door hung from a rusted hinge. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. My curiosity outweighed my better judgment. As I approached the cabin, I noticed it was surrounded by a circle of stones, like a makeshift barrier. Some of the stones were etched with symbols resembling runes, but none that I recognized. When I stepped inside, the smell of rotting wood and mold hit me like a wall. The interior was small and dim. There was an old, broken table, a fallen chair, and a tattered mattress in the corner. But what caught my attention was a small shelf filled with ancient books. One of them lay open, its pages filled with words in a language I couldn't identify. The pages were stained with dark blotches that looked unsettlingly like dried blood. As I examined the room, I heard a faint sound like a whisper coming from outside. I stepped out quickly, but no one was there. The forest was utterly silent, and a chill ran down my spine. I decided it would be best to set up camp at a safe distance, so I moved about 200 meters away and pitched my tent. Night fell quickly, and the sky was completely overcast, blocking any light from the moon. I lit a small fire and tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, and moving toward my tent. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing beyond the trees. The footsteps stopped, but the silence became even more oppressive. I tried to sleep, but in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound that froze me to my core, knocking on my tent. It was soft but rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was trying to call me outside. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I asked in a trembling voice, "Who's there?" There was no answer, only the sound of knocking now growing louder. Summoning all my courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. There was no one there, but when I looked down, I saw footprints. They weren't human. They were large, with claw marks, and formed a perfect circle around my tent. I scrambled back inside, but before I could gather my thoughts, I heard something worse, faint laughter like that of a child. It seemed to come from all directions. Peeking through the tent's window, I saw it. Among the trees stood a figure, tall, with arms that were too long for its body and a head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a light that wasn't there. My heart raced. The figure took a step toward me, and the laughter grew louder. Grabbing my backpack, I bolted, abandoning my tent and the fire. I didn't know where I was running, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I ran, I felt something following me like a heavy shadow. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me in the darkness. After what felt like hours, I saw the faint light of dawn and stumbled upon the stream again. I followed it until I reached the main road. I didn't stop until I got to my car and drove far away from that place. The next day, I told a friend about the cabin. His face went pale and he said, "You shouldn't have gone inside. They say that place was used for rituals. Anyone who gets close never comes back the same." Since then, I've never camped alone again. And sometimes at night, I hear knocking on my bedroom window as if something is still trying to find me. Story 3. The Forest of Laments. I've always been fascinated by local legends. During a trip to the countryside, I heard about a forest that the locals avoided at all costs. They called it the Forest of Laments and warned that no one should enter it after nightfall. The stories varied. Some spoke of lost spirits, while others told of creatures that mimicked human voices to lure victims. To me, it sounded like the perfect mystery to explore. That afternoon, I rented a Jeep and drove to the forest entrance. The road was riddled with potholes, and the vegetation seemed to engulf the path, but I arrived before sunset. The sign at the entrance was worn, its letters nearly illegible, but the warning was clear: danger, entry forbidden after dusk. The initial trail was peaceful, lined with tall trees that blocked part of the sunlight, but I could still hear birds and the rustling of leaves. After about an hour of walking, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew closer together, their roots intertwining across the ground as if trying to block the way. The birdsong ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence, and the air felt cooler, even though it was summer. That's when I heard the first sound, soft crying coming from the direction of a small stream. It sounded like a child. My instincts told me to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sound to the stream, but no one was there. The crying stopped, and the silence returned, more stifling than before. I continued walking, but the trail had completely disappeared, as if it had never been there. The trees seemed to form natural barriers, forcing me to follow a path I hadn't chosen. When I tried to retrace my steps, I realized I was utterly lost. The sun began to set, and the forest was swallowed by shadows. I turned on my flashlight, but its beams seemed to be swallowed by the surrounding darkness. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold, a voice calling my name. Pedro? It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably human. I swung the flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing to see. My heart raced as the voice called again, closer this time. Pedro? Help me. The voice was feminine but carried an odd, inhuman undertone. I decided to keep moving, ignoring the sound as best I could. But with every step, the voice grew louder. When I turned around, I saw something between the trees, a hunched figure with long, disheveled hair, partially obscured by the vegetation. Its head tilted unnaturally as if it couldn't hold it upright. Please, it whispered again, extending a thin, pale hand. Without thinking, I began to run. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming tunnels that restricted my view. I heard footsteps behind me, light, quick, as though something was following me. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. When I lifted my head, I found myself in a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, and in the middle stood an old, gnarled tree stump. The ground around it was covered in symbols drawn with ash. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. Around the edges of the clearing, hidden in the shadows, were figures. They were tall and humanoid in shape, but their faces were completely blank. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just smooth, pale voids. They didn't move, but I could feel their gaze on me. I tried to leave the clearing, but my legs felt heavy, as if something invisible was holding me back. The figures began to approach slowly, and the air grew so cold that my breath formed clouds. One of them got closer, and I heard the feminine voice again. Why did you come? The figure extended an arm toward me, and an icy chill shot through my body. That's when I realized I wouldn't escape unless I acted. With all my strength, I managed to stand and run back into the forest. The trees seemed to part from me as if they wanted me to leave. But the footsteps behind me didn't stop. When I finally saw the road, relief washed over me. I jumped into the Jeep and sped away without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the village. The Jeep was covered in leaves and scratches, as though the forest had tried to hold on to me until the last moment. The villagers weren't surprised when I told them what had happened. One of them simply said, "They let you go, if they want to." I never returned to that forest. And to this day, sometimes I hear my name being called in whispers, even when I'm alone at home. Story 4. The Shadow in the Fog. I've always been an adventurer. Remote forests, unknown trails, unexplored places, these were exactly what drew me in. That's how I ended up in a mountainous region deep in the countryside, famous for its dense forests shrouded in near-constant fog. The place seemed perfect for exploring, but the locals had their stories. They warned me about one specific area, a part of the forest they called the Valley of Shadows. It's easy to go in, an old man from the village said, but not everyone comes out. I thought it was just superstition, a tale to scare outsiders. I decided to ignore the warning and set off early the next morning. The entrance to the valley was marked by twisted trees, their gnarled branches stretching out like arms trying to grasp something. The fog was thicker there, blanketing the ground like a white shroud. At first, everything seemed peaceful, almost magical. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of my footsteps on the damp leaves. I walked for hours, guided only by a GPS marking a course I'd planned myself. The valley was dense, the trees so close together they blocked out the sunlight. Then I noticed something strange. The GPS started to fail. The route disappeared, and the screen flickered as if it were struggling to find its bearings. As I tried to recalibrate it, I heard a distant sound. A whisper, faint and indistinct, coming from deep within the fog. I looked around but saw nothing. I decided to keep moving, but the feeling of being watched began to unsettle me. With every step, the whisper grew louder until it sounded like multiple voices speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. The fog thickened, and I began to lose all sense of direction. It felt as though the forest itself was pulling me deeper. After some time, I saw something ahead, a shadow. It was tall and thin, moving slowly between the trees. At first, I thought it was just an illusion caused by the fog, but the shadow remained, moving in an irregular, almost deliberate manner, as though it were watching me. I called out, trying to sound confident. "Who's there?" There was no response, but the shadow stopped moving. I froze in place. The figure had no defined form. It was as if the fog itself had taken shape. Suddenly, it began to move toward me, fast and silent. My instincts screamed at me to run, and that's exactly what I did. As I ran, I heard footsteps behind me, light but quick, as though something was gliding just above the ground. My heart pounded with every second. When I glanced back, I saw the shadow was closer now, larger, its edges quivering as though it were struggling to stay solid. Then I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. The shadow loomed over me. I tried to stand, but something cold brushed against my leg. When I looked down, I saw my pants were wet, though there was no water on the ground. It was as if the fog itself had grabbed me. I managed to free myself and ran aimlessly until I stumbled into a clearing. The silence returned, and for a moment I thought I was safe. In the center of the clearing stood what looked like a stone altar, covered in moss and cracked with age. As I approached, I realized the cracks formed symbols resembling eyes, all seemingly watching me. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided to leave, but before I could take a step, the shadow appeared again, this time beside me. It didn't move anymore. It stood there, tall and imposing, like a sentinel. Then the voices returned, clearer now. They came from all directions, whispering my name. The shadow extended what appeared to be an arm, and I felt an intense cold that seemed to pierce my skin. My body froze and my vision began to darken. I don't know how, but I managed to summon the strength to move. I ran through the clearing, plunging into the fog, which felt denser and more oppressive than ever. Every time I looked back, the shadow was following me closer, as though it was toying with me. When I finally saw the valley's exit, my heart nearly exploded with relief. I leaped out of the fog and everything went eerily quiet. When I returned to the village, I told the old man who had warned me what had happened. He simply shook his head with a worried expression. "You were lucky," he said. "The shadow doesn't usually let anyone go. It always takes something." I checked my hands and legs, expecting to find some wound or mark, but there was nothing. It wasn't until days later that I realized something was wrong. Since that night, I felt a constant presence. Sometimes I see a shadow in the corner of my room, tall and trembling slightly, like the one I saw in the valley. And every time I try to sleep, I hear my name being called in a low voice, coming from within the darkness. Story 5. The Ritual in the Forest. When I visited a small mountain town, I heard about a hidden trail surrounded by legends and mysteries. They said it led to a place called the Clearing of Bones, a spot locals believed had been used for ancient rituals for centuries. No one knew exactly what happened there, but one thing was certain. Anyone who ventured into that forest rarely came back the same. My curiosity took me to the trail's entrance the next day. It was a narrow path surrounded by towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was heavy, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Soon, I began to notice marks on the trees, symbols carved into their trunks, some weathered by time, others fresher, as if someone had recently renewed them. After about an hour of walking, the trail disappeared entirely. I decided to keep going, driven by a strange instinct that seemed to pull me forward. That's when the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and a thin mist started to form along the ground. The earthy scent of damp soil was now mixed with something metallic, like blood. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. It was faint, coming from all directions. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, as if voices were trying to guide me. I followed the sound, and after a few minutes, I arrived at the clearing. The scene before me was disturbing. At the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, covered in moss and carved with the same symbols I'd seen on the trees. In the middle of the circle was a stone altar, stained with something dark and dry that looked like blood. Around the altar, bones were scattered, small and large, clearly both human and animal. As I examined the area, I realized the silence had become absolute. There was no wind, no birds, no sounds of the forest. The only noise was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That's when I felt it. I didn't hear footsteps, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, I turned, and there it was, a hooded figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The hood obscured its face, but its eyes glowed faintly yellow, like smoldering embers. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze piercing through me, studying me. The whispering returned, but this time it came from the figure. It wasn't a human voice. It was distorted, guttural, as if echoing inside my mind. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, cold and clear. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry. When I shone my flashlight at the figure, it stepped closer to the altar. That's when I noticed it wasn't alone. Other hooded shapes began to appear among the trees, silent and moving in unison. They surrounded the clearing, each one whispering, creating a low, sinister chorus. The figure at the altar raised an arm, and the whispers turned into a sharp, piercing scream that echoed through the forest. The other figures began advancing toward me, slow and deliberate, as if they knew I had nowhere to run. Panic overtook me, and I sprinted back into the forest, but the path seemed different. The trees were closer together, as if trying to trap me. The mist had thickened, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I could hear the footsteps behind me, soft but relentless, accompanied by the whispers. Finally, I saw faint sunlight filtering through the trees and ran toward it. As soon as I crossed out of the forest, the sound stopped. The air returned to normal, but my body was trembling. I looked back, expecting to see the figures, but there was nothing, just still trees. Yet, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I returned to the town and shared my experience, but the locals seemed more frightened than surprised. An older man said, "They let you go this time, but now you bear their mark." Confused, I asked what he meant. He simply pointed to my arm. When I looked, I saw a symbol burned into my skin like a brand. It was the same symbol I'd seen on the trees and the altar. Since that day, I haven't been able to sleep in silence. I always hear whispers even when I'm alone. And sometimes I catch glimpses of hooded figures in the corner of my eyes, just for an instant before they vanish. I know the forest still calls to me. I know that one day I'll have to go back. Story 6. The Whispering Tree. Since I was a child, I'd always heard stories about the Tree of Lament, a gigantic fig tree in the heart of a dense forest near my town. They said it was hundreds of years old, and no one knew exactly who planted it or how it had survived for so long. According to legend, at night, it whispered the secrets of those who had died near it, calling out to anyone daring enough to approach. As a skeptic, I thought it was just another tale made up to scare kids and keep wanderers away. One night, I decided to prove the legends were nothing but nonsense. I packed my backpack with a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a pocket knife, and headed toward the forest. The trailhead was marked by 2 dead trees forming an archway like a portal. As soon as I stepped through, the air changed. It was colder and denser, and the earthy scent of damp soil was far stronger than usual. I walked for about an hour, lighting my path with the flashlight, until I saw something ahead. It was the tree. Its silhouette was immense, far larger than any other tree in the forest. Its branches stretched out like gnarled arms, and its trunk was so thick it seemed impossible to encircle. Despite its grandeur, something about it felt deeply wrong. Its bark was as dark as charcoal, and the air was filled with a metallic odor reminiscent of blood. As I approached, I realized the forest around me had gone completely silent. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of the wind. Only the muffled noise of my own footsteps. When I reached the base of the tree, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. Handprints were etched into its bark. Hundreds of them, in different sizes, as if people had pressed their hands against the trunk before disappearing. That's when I heard it. The first sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound seemed to come from within the tree as though something was trapped inside. I stepped closer, placing my hand on the bark. The whisper stopped abruptly, and a bone-chilling cold shot up my arm, as though the tree were drawing something out of me. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly but saw nothing. My flashlight illuminated only the twisted branches and the surrounding darkness. Deciding it was best not to linger, I began walking away, but the footsteps followed, growing closer. When I looked back again, I saw something that froze me in place. A figure stood partially hidden behind the trunk. It wasn't entirely human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed like embers. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and clearer. This time, I could understand the words. "Why did you come?" The voice echoed inside my head. I started running, but the tree's roots seemed to move, trying to ensnare me. I tripped and fell, my flashlight rolling away. When I retrieved it, the light flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw several figures around the tree. They all looked the same, motionless, watching me. Finally, I managed to get up and sprinted out of the clearing. The forest felt endless, but after what seemed like hours, I saw the archway of the dead trees marking the trailhead. Once I stepped out, the air returned to normal, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave me. The next day, I told a friend familiar with the region about my experience. He gave me a serious look and asked, "Did you touch the tree?" I nodded and he sighed. "They say that when you touch it, it marks you. Now you carry a piece of it with you." I didn't understand what he meant until I began noticing changes. At night, I hear whispers in my room like those from the tree, and sometimes I catch glimpses of shadows in the corner of my eyes, disappearing before I can focus on them. Recently, I've noticed something even more disturbing. A small mark has appeared on my hand, resembling the outline of a leaf. No matter what I do, it won't go away. I fear that one day, I'll become one of the figures around that tree, forever bound to its lament. Story 7. The Lake in the Shadowed Forest. I've always loved fishing in isolated spots. There's something about the peace and quiet of a hidden lake that brings me tranquility. So when I heard about an untouched lake deep within a dense forest, I didn't think twice. The locals, however, warned me not to go. "That lake isn't for humans," an old man with a grave expression told me. "There are no fish there, only echoes of something ancient." I dismissed the warnings as superstition. The next day, armed with my fishing rod and a backpack full of supplies, I entered the forest. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, and nature's sounds surrounded me, birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. But as I neared the lake, something began to change. The sounds of the forest gradually faded until they disappeared completely. Not even the wind made a noise. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as though something unseen was watching me. At last I reached the lake. Its surface was unnervingly still, like glass, reflecting the trees around it with perfect clarity. The sun, which had been shining brightly along the trail, seemed unable to penetrate the mist that hung low over the water. I set up my gear on the shore, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at me. When I cast my line into the water, I noticed how profound the silence was, so deep that even the splash of the hook breaking the lake's surface sounded muted. I sat and waited, but something felt off. There was no movement in the water, no ripples, no sign of life. After about an hour without a single bite, I grew restless. That's when I noticed something in the water. A small ripple began to form at the lake center, even though there was no wind. The ripples spread slowly as if something was surfacing. I grabbed my flashlight to illuminate the area, but I saw only the dark, still water. When I turned back to my gear, I heard it, a faint sound almost imperceptible, a voice. It was low, like a whisper, but distinctly feminine. It seemed to come from the direction of the lake. Come? My heart raced. I looked back at the water, but no one was there. The voice came again, clearer this time. Come to me? An inexplicable force seemed to draw me toward the edge. It was as though my mind was being overtaken, telling me that stepping into the water was the right thing to do. Just as I was about to take a step, I heard something behind me, rapid footsteps as if someone was running along the trail. When I turned, there was nothing. When I looked back at the lake, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was in the water, partially submerged. Her face was pale, her eyes as dark as the lake itself, and her long hair floated around her. She didn't move, but her gaze was locked onto me. Then she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was empty, filled with an intent I couldn't understand. Step in, she said again, her voice now echoing inside my head. I stumbled backward, but I felt something cold touch my ankle. Looking down, I saw the lake's water creeping up the shore, silently encircling me. I pulled my foot free and ran, but the sound of the water seemed to follow me. I didn't hear footsteps or see the figure pursuing me, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. When I finally reached the main trail, the sound stopped. I turned back to look at the lake, and it was as still as before. But in the center, I saw what looked like a hand emerging from the water before slowly sinking back into the depths. I returned to the village and recounted what had happened. One of the locals, a younger man, turned pale as he listened. She tried to take you. That's what she does. Many before you have disappeared into that lake. I asked who she was, but no one would answer. Since that day, I've never entered a forest alone, and I avoid bodies of water, even the smallest streams. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear the same voice calling to me, asking me to return. I know that if I do, I'll never leave again. Story 8. The Rituals of the Ashen Forest. My passion for forgotten places led me to a little-known forest called the Ashen Forest by the locals. They said the area had been cursed ever since a great fire destroyed a nearby village decades ago. Nothing grew properly there, and the trees were twisted, covered by a thin layer of what looked like soot. Even animals avoided the place. When I asked about the forest, an older resident warned me, "If you go there, never step into the circle. It's made to trap, not to protect." I laughed off the superstition, but his concerned gaze stayed with me as I planned my exploration. The next morning, I entered the forest armed with my backpack, a flashlight, and a camera. The entrance was ominous, flanked by blackened trees that seemed lifeless. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something odd. The ground was blanketed by a thin layer of ash, yet there was no evidence of any recent burns. The trees seemed to lean inward as though they were watching me. After about an hour of walking, I reached a clearing. At its center was a perfect circle of stones surrounding a barren patch of ground. Inside the circle, the earth was darker, almost black. While observing the scene, a chill ran down my spine. The air inside the clearing was colder, and a metallic scent, like blood, filled the air. I decided to take some photos, but as I powered on my camera, it began to malfunction. The screen flickered, and a strange noise emanated from the speaker, a low whisper. "Must be interference," I muttered to myself, though I wasn't convinced. Suddenly, I heard something coming from the trees behind me. It was a rhythmic sound, like murmurs, but the words were indecipherable. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area but saw nothing. Deciding I had seen enough, I started to leave the clearing. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints surrounded the circle, large, deep impressions from bare feet that didn't match mine. Before I could react, A sharp crack, like a branch snapping, echoed through the forest. I turned to look back and saw something I will never forget. A tall, gaunt, hooded figure stood inside the circle. Its body appeared to be made of shadows, and its presence was suffocating. Although the hood obscured its face, I could feel its gaze piercing into me. It raised one hand and pointed directly at me. My body went cold as the murmurs around me grew louder, forming a guttural chorus. The stones around the circle began to glow faintly with an orange light, like embers about to die. Summoning every ounce of survival instinct, I ran. The path back seemed endless. The trees felt alive, shifting and closing in to block my way, and the murmurs continued as though the voices were chasing me. At one point, I tripped and fell, my flashlight rolling out of reach. When I looked back, the figure was there again, now outside the circle. It was closer, its arms outstretched as though trying to grab me. Grabbing my flashlight, I scrambled to my feet and kept running. Finally, I saw daylight breaking through the trees. An overwhelming sense of relief flooded me as I escaped the forest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I drove back to the village, something still felt wrong. My ears were ringing and my vision seemed hazy. When I returned to the inn, the old man who had warned me stared at me intently. "You stepped into the circle, didn't you?" he asked before I could say anything. I shook my head, denying it, but he pointed to my arm. When I looked, I saw a mark that hadn't been there before. It resembled a burn in the shape of one of the symbols I'd seen on the stones. Since that day, whenever I'm alone, I hear the same murmurs in the distance. Sometimes I feel a presence behind me, but when I turn, no one is there. I know somehow that the Ashen forest still watches me, and I'm terrified that one day it will call me back. Story 9. The Cave in the Lost Forest. I was searching for a challenge. After exploring countless forests and trails, I heard about a place called the Lost Forest, a location locals avoided at all costs. Legend had it that anyone who entered would eventually find a cave, and those who dared to venture inside would never emerge the same. It was exactly the kind of mystery that piqued my curiosity. With my gear ready, I headed to the trail leading into the forest. The entrance was almost invisible, hidden among dense trees and overgrown bushes. As soon as I stepped in, the air seemed to change. It was colder than outside, and the forest carried a metallic smell, like blood mingled with damp earth. I walked for hours before realizing this place was unlike anything I had seen before. The trees were towering, their branches forming a canopy so dense that barely any sunlight pierced through. The silence was profound, with a carpet of dry leaves underfoot that seemed untouched by time. There were no signs of life. No birds, no insects, no animals. While walking, something caught my eye, an opening in the ground. It was an entrance to a cave, surrounded by moss-covered stones etched with small symbols. It looked ancient, yet eerily preserved. A voice inside me urged caution, but curiosity won out. I grabbed my flashlight, adjusted my backpack, and descended into the opening. The slope was steep, and the cave's air was even colder. My footsteps echoed against the stone walls, amplifying the eerie sensation that I wasn't alone. Strange markings covered the walls, etchings of eyes and spirals. Some faintly glowed under the beam of my flashlight, as if they had been freshly carved. After a few minutes of walking, I began to hear something. It was faint, almost like a murmur coming from deep within the cave. The sound was rhythmic and hypnotic, like a chant repeated endlessly. I pressed on, deeper into the darkness, until I entered an open chamber. In the center of the chamber stood a circle of stones, similar to one I had seen in another forest clearing, but inside this circle was a statue. The statue depicted a humanoid figure, but its proportions were all wrong. Elongated arms, a small head, and hands ending in claw-like fingers. Its eyes were empty hollows that seemed to stare back at me, despite being made of stone. As I examined the statue, the murmurs grew louder, as though the entire cave were whispering to me. That's when I noticed something chilling. The shadows around me were moving, but the beam of my flashlight stayed still. It was as if the shadows had a life of their own. When I turned, I saw something that froze me in place. A figure stood at the chamber's entrance. It was tall and thin, its translucent skin reflecting the dim light. Its eyes glowed a pale yellow, and it appeared to hover rather than walk. The figure raised one arm and pointed at me. Instantly, I felt an overwhelming pressure in my chest, as if something was pulling me toward the stone circle. "You should not be here," a voice said, but it wasn't normal. It sounded as if the cave itself was speaking to me. Without thinking, I dropped my backpack and sprinted back the way I had come. The shadows seemed to chase me, and the murmurs turned into deafening, anguished screams. When I reached the cave's entrance, I felt something icy brush against my shoulder. I didn't dare look back. Scrambling out of the cave, I ran through the forest, not stopping until I found the trailhead. Back on the road, I paused to catch my breath. My ears were ringing, and the sensation of being watched lingered. I jumped into my car and drove to the nearest village, where I recounted my experience to one of the locals. He listened in silence before saying, "You went into the cave, didn't you? No one should go down there. They say it's a gateway to something that doesn't belong to our world." When I glanced down at my hands, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On my right palm was a mark resembling the symbols I had seen carved into the cave walls. Since that day, I've had strange dreams. In them, I'm back in the cave, surrounded by the moving shadows, while the figure watches me with its glowing eyes. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night to the sound of murmurs, coming from somewhere inside my own home. Story 10. The Chants of the Nameless Forest. Traveling to unexplored places has always been my escape from routine, but in hindsight, I should have heeded the warnings about the Nameless Forest. I discovered its existence in an old map I bought at a curiosity fair. It was an isolated place with no registered trails and seemed perfect for a weekend away from everything. However, everyone I mentioned it to reacted with the same expression of dread. "That forest has no end," an elderly woman said, gripping my arm firmly. "Those who enter either disappear or return, changed." I dismissed it as folklore, a story to keep the curious away. With my backpack full of supplies and my camera, I set off for the point marked on the map. The entrance to the forest was discreet, almost imperceptible, with tall trees and such dense vegetation that it blocked out the sunlight. As soon as I stepped in, the air changed. It was colder, damp, and the silence was profound, as if the place were waiting. I walked for a few hours, marking my path with colored ribbons to avoid getting lost. The trees were towering, their roots forming patterns that reminded me of symbols. There was no visible trail, so I followed what seemed to be a dry stream bed. That's when I heard the first sound, a low chant coming from afar. It was hard to make out the words, but it sounded like an ancient, repetitive melody that echoed through the forest. I followed the sound, intrigued yet uneasy. After a few more minutes of walking, I arrived at a clearing. In the center was what looked like a stone altar, covered in moss and etched with symbols I didn't recognize. Around it, tree trunks were marked with the same carvings. The chant was louder here, but I saw no one. I examined the altar and noticed its surface was stained with dark marks, like dried blood. Then I saw something that chilled me to the bone. On the ground around the altar were footprints, but they weren't normal. They were large, human-like, but ended in long claws. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was then that I felt, for the first time, that I wasn't alone. I looked around, but the clearing was empty. I decided it was best to leave, but as I turned, I saw something between the trees. They glowed amber, fixed on me. The figure was tall, thin, and its skin looked gray, like the bark of a dead tree. It had no face, only the eyes, which seemed to glow more intensely with each passing second. My mind screamed to run, but my body was frozen. Then I heard the voice. It didn't come from the figure, but seemed to echo inside my head. "You came to us?" The words were slow, like a dragging whisper. When I finally managed to move, I ran through the forest, but the path seemed different. The trees appeared to shift, closing in front of me, and the sunlight vanished rapidly. The chant returned, louder and more urgent, as if it were beside me. Each time I looked back, the figure was closer, its claws outstretched. Finally, I saw a light and ran toward it, stumbling and nearly falling. When I crossed the edge of the forest, the chanting stopped abruptly. The air grew lighter and the sun shone again. However, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I turned back and saw the glowing eyes still fixed on me, before disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Back in the village, I recounted what happened to one of the elders. He looked at me with a resigned expression. You've been marked. They let you leave, but they always take something. Since then, my life has never been the same. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with the feeling that I'm back in that forest. I hear the chant in my dreams, and when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of amber eyes glowing for just a moment. I fear that one day the forest will come to claim me. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.